The wonder we feel when we look into a star-filled sky is the same kind of wonder and curiosity that inspired inquiring minds of the Renaissance to seek an understanding of their world. It was an age when modern science was born. This is the Scientific Revolution, Part 1. In our program, we have three subject matter experts. R. Guy Irwin, Professor of Religion and History, California Lutheran University.
Remember that in the late Middle Ages, people lived in a world, especially people in Italy, of course, where the Renaissance was born, they lived in a world in which they were surrounded by the ruins of a civilization that in some ways had accomplished technological marvels that they themselves were only now beginning to be able to do again.
Teofilo Ruiz, Professor of History, University of California, Los Angeles.
They are basic, great principles, but these principles are continuously challenged. They were challenged in the 16th and 17th century by what we call the Scientific Revolution.
Margaret Jacob, Professor of History, University of California, Los Angeles.
When you think about why the Scientific Revolution occurred, why were there so many, as you might say, geniuses, all converging in Europe in, say, the period, 1550 to 1700. Why did that happen? On one level, we haven't got a clue. We just don't know.
Approaching our subject in a chronological way, we can place the beginning of the scientific revolution roughly in the mid-16th century, as Margaret Jacob indicated, about the year 1550.
Well, I said 1550. I really should have been pedantic and very precise and said 1543, because that's when we say the scientific revolution began. And we say that in order to honor Copernicus, because it's in that year that Copernicus published his book on the revolution of the heavenly orbs.
While we don't know precisely why so many great minds emerged at about the same time during the scientific revolution, we can identify some of the things that played a part in this phenomenon.
Up until that point, most of the best minds in Europe went into the church and they became students of theology. And one of the things that's changing is that the best minds are not as attracted to theology. Many of them turn to the law. In a sense, the study of nature is another way of studying the law. In this sense, it's a study of God's law.
To appreciate what the scientific pioneers accomplished, it helps to understand what they faced. The Roman Catholic Church had the power to censor new ideas that contradicted church teaching. There was no room for science that disagreed with the Bible. For example, to suggest the earth revolves around a stationary sun was heresy.
The reality is that this is an institution that is power drunk. It has far too much authority in far too many areas of life in Western Europe.
The church censored, imprisoned, and even killed dissenters.
It's not just the churches, but also the scholarly community, the kind of scholarly establishment, who often stand in the way.
If you were young and eager and interested in studying nature, you were far better off attaching yourself to one of the new academies or going to one of the courts where a local prince would be prepared to put up some money to let you have a laboratory or an observatory. You get far more done than you would sitting at one of the universities.
One of the greatest problems faced by the thinkers of the scientific revolution was, how do the heavens hold together? The prevailing wisdom held to Aristotle's view.
The ancient thinkers, beginning with Aristotle and then Ptolemy, said that in effect the heavens were not, the planets were not real bodies in the sense of that our Earth is a real body. They were crystalline spheres, and they were held in place, as it were, in tracks. They were, as it, you almost imagine them as stuck there, running in prefixed orbits. And that notion, in one variety or another, held until the early 17th century.
Later, Ptolemy of Alexandria added many more complicated spheres to Aristotle's model to try to explain its inconsistencies.
It becomes a kind of orthodox way of thinking, the paradigms for the period. It will hold sway in Europe until the 17th century, and it is precisely the questioning of the Ptolemaic worldview, of the Ptolemaic view of the universe, that essentially is at the very beginnings of the scientific revolution.
There were several factors that came together to create a new era in thought and the proliferation of knowledge. One of these factors was the invention of the printing press in 1454.
I think the invention of the printing press has a part to play in the dissemination of the new knowledge about nature. There's no question but that knowledge about the natural world requires a conversation among the educated about what is being learned, and printing helps that conversation take place.
Another factor that contributed to the scientific revolution is the beginning, in the 15th century, of worldwide exploration.
I don't think you can divorce the study of nature from the overseas trade and exploration. It's sort of like a jolt that's delivered to the European imagination.
Having looked at the influences leading up to the scientific revolution, let's turn our attention to the great minds that emerged in this period of history. Traveling along our historical timeline of the scientific revolution, the first person we encounter is Leonardo da Vinci. Coincidentally, he was also perhaps the most talented and remarkable person of the Renaissance. He was an artist, scientist, and inventor, and was fascinated by the way things worked. Leonardo did extensive studies of bird wings and used them as a model of possible flying machines. He designed many military forts and weapons. He did studies of the structure and growth of plants, and he was a student of human anatomy. Leonardo combined the eye and training of an artist with the careful observations of a scientist. He worked in secret, fearing misunderstanding, and often used a coded script that had to be held up to a mirror to be read. Some of Leonardo's works weren't discovered until the last century. He had little direct impact on the development of science, although he was greatly respected as an artist. Nevertheless, his work is a fine example of the growing curiosity about nature at the start of the scientific revolution. A man born about 20 years after Leonardo is our second historical figure, Nicholas Copernicus.
What Copernicus did is look at Ptolemy's system. Ptolemy's system was incredibly difficult and complex. Why? Because if you posit the Earth at the center of the universe, and of course we now know that the universe is more than the solar system, but if you posit the Earth at the center of the universe or of the solar system, then the motion of the planets becomes very erratic.
In his book Concerning the Revolutions of the Heavenly Orbs, Copernicus shows that the Earth and the planets revolve around the Sun. But he waited until just before his death to publish it.
He had waited so long to publish it because he knew he was going against official church teaching when he would argue, as he does in the book, that the sun lies at the center of the universe and the planets, including our Earth, move about it. Now that's what's truly revolutionary in his book On the Revolution of the Heavenly Orbs. But bear in mind that Copernicus has many, many traditional elements in his thinking. He holds the sun in the center, but he keeps the planets moving about the sun in perfectly circular orbits.
He was right to worry about the church's reaction to his book. The church put it on a list of prohibited materials where it stayed for 200 years. While he still left room in his findings for Aristotle's crystalline spheres, holding the heavens together, he concluded that the apparent motion of the sun was caused by the earth revolving around the sun, and that only the moon revolved around the earth.
But in order to explain the position of the planets at certain times in the heavens, where it appears the planet is closer to the earth than far away, he has to build in what's called epicycles.
That is to say, the planets not only are rotating around the earth, but they are also moving in little loops as they do so. The mathematics of this is extraordinarily complex.
And while he has far fewer of those than Ptolemy has in his universe, where the earth is in the center, still Copernicus has to have quite a few. So we're a long way off from the sort of classic Newtonian universe, but still, it's a very important moment.
It is revolutionary. The spread of Copernican ideas in the next 200 years will transform the world.
Moving further along our timeline, our next encounter is Leonhard Fuchs. The Age of Herbals, as it is sometimes called, was a time of discovery in the field of botany. The word herbals refers to botanical books describing plants with medicinal value. Leonhard Fuchs, commonly referred to as the father of German botany, made great advances with his work called Natural Life. His herbal book contains illustrations of over 500 full-page drawings of plants, featuring some 400 German plants and 100 foreign plants, including Indian corn and pumpkin from America. The introduction of Natural Life contains the first vocabulary of botanical terms. The popularity of Fuchs' works helped inspire a back-to-nature movement that began to take a first-hand look at plants and animals. As we move forward in history, we meet Andreas Vesalius, a brilliant physician. In the early 16th century, Galen's book on anatomical preparations was still the text being used in medical universities. It was a young, impatient Andreas Vesalius who would rise to challenge Galen's teachings.
You tend to think of the scientific revolution as confined to cosmic issues, the plotting of the heavens and so forth, but the work of Vesalius shows us very fundamentally that this mapping of the universe is occurring at the absolute human level as well.
The more he learned, the more disturbed he became by the many errors that he found in Galen's teachings, and he set out to correct those errors. The result was Concerning the Structure of the Human Body, commonly referred to as the Fabrica. This book, the Fabrica, was the most accurate on human anatomy up to that time, and today it is still astounding in its beauty and accuracy. Thanks also to the printing press, the Fabrica was reproduced with great accuracy.
What we, I think, need to realize is that the curiosity that explodes in the time of Vesalius engages flora and fauna, rocks, the seacoasts, the mountains, everything is now being subjected to natural philosophical inquiry.
Vesalius foresaw that his book would bring him trouble from medical teachers objecting to his questioning of Galen, and more dangerously, an attack from the church. He was right to worry. the book's publication cost him his job at the famous University of Padua. He was so persecuted that he finally gave up the study of anatomy entirely and moved to Spain. The Fabrica would remain in circulation and would become a guide and inspiration to future medical students. A contemporary of Vesalius, born just 2 years after him, was Conrad Gessner. Estimates vary, but it is believed that as many as 20 million species of living things inhabit the earth. In ancient times, Aristotle described 500. At the time of the Renaissance, the number had reached 6,000. Conrad Gessner was the man who categorized those known living things. The start of modern zoology began with Gessner's 5-volume, 4,000-page work called History of Animals, begun in 1551. Modern critics are in general agreement that Gessner was the most learned naturalist of his period, and perhaps the best zoologist to have appeared since Aristotle. Too busy himself to do much observing, Gessner depended on descriptions of travelers, sailors, and hunters who had seen animals of newly discovered lands. Some accounts came from a good imagination, with stories of strange creatures like the basilisk, a lizard monster hatched from the egg of a rooster.
After a while, you can no longer accept the kind of things that Pliny has said, that on the very boundaries of the world there are people, or John of Mandeville, at the boundaries of the world there are Amazons and people with dogs' heads and things like that.
In his commentary, Gessner distinguished between the believable and the unbelievable, and included them all for the sake of completeness. For each animal, he described their habits and behavior, the means of capture, and the animal's uses as food or medicine. Gessner's work was very popular, surpassing all other students of natural history for over 100 years. His works helped in the overall knowledge of the world around us. One of the great minds of England was William Gilbert. Some of the titles conferred on Gilbert were the father of experimental science in England, the father of electricity, and the founder of magnetic and electrical sciences. Gilbert was a medical doctor trained at Cambridge. He became chief physician to Queen Elizabeth and King James. Being wealthy and having good connections, Gilbert was able to conduct expensive magnetic experiments and attract leading men of science to him. Gilbert's basic principle was this:
scientific knowledge is valued only if founded on the basis of practical experiment and observation. Idle speculations and theories are worthless unless they are supported by demonstrable evidence.
Today, demonstrable evidence that can be repeated is a key part of scientific experimentation.
In 1600, William Gilbert published a book on the magnet, which he showed that the Earth had within it a kind of natural magnetism, that those substances that responded to the Earth's magnetic pole would point toward the North Pole. Now, this was very useful for people who were engaged in navigation, but it also raised the question of where did this magnetism come from?
All the pious believers, including Isaac Newton, attributed the force to spiritual powers, but gradually people came to believe that the forces of nature are within nature itself. In his book, De Magnete, Gilbert introduced what most historians of science regard as his greatest contribution, his view of the Earth itself as one great magnet. Gilbert was the first scientist to distinguish between electrical and magnetic attraction. He is the man who introduced the word electricity into the English language. As we move along our historic timeline, we come to the greatest astronomical observer before the invention of the telescope, Tycho Brahe. Tycho and his assistant, Johannes Kepler, who continued his work after him, made great contributions. But astrology was confused with astronomy.
One of the things we must remember that a good number of the scientists believe in witches, believe in astrology. They are magicians, they are alchemists. So that the boundaries between science and religion and magic are being continuously redrawn. Science is a bit of magic and a bit of religion. And religion is a little magic and a bit of science, and so on and so on.
Remember that in the 15th and 16th centuries, astrology was a corollary of astronomy, that any world leader of any importance would have someone at his court who he could look to interpret the stars. The popes had astrologers, the Holy Roman Emperor had astrologers. Many of the people we see today as the founders of modern astronomy, like Kepler and Brahe, people like that, were actually employed as astrologers.
Tycho's study of the heavens was subsidized by a royal gift. Tycho's foster father had died while saving the life of Danish King Frederick II. Out of gratitude, the king gave Tycho an island and the money to build the ultimate astronomical observatory of his day. With his beautifully crafted precision instruments, Tycho produced far better data of the heavens than anyone before him.
Well, Tycho was a great astronomer, and his laboratory was one of the places where some of the most important observations were done on the planets, among them Mars.
In 1572, he spotted a new star, or nova, sometimes called Tycho's star. It was actually a faint star that had exploded in what we now call a supernova. To those who still clung to Aristotle's idea that the cosmos was perfect and unchanging, the event was unsettling. With his superior instruments, Tycho also made exacting measurements of the path of a comet. He saw that the comet followed an elliptical path, which challenged another of Aristotle's theories. If the heavens were composed of nested crystalline spheres, how could the comet's path arc through them, as Tycho's observation clearly showed it did?
Now it is quite clear to me that there are no solid spheres in the heavens.
So Tycho Brahe is an example of how the observational side of the scientific revolution really pays off.
Moving further along our historic timeline, we meet Sir Francis Bacon.
Well, of all of the important contributors to the early scientific revolution, Francis Bacon is the hardest to classify. Francis Bacon is not an original philosophical thinker, nor is he a great experimenter.
He was not a scientist, and he made no great discoveries, but he laid important ground rules for experimental science. This greatly improved the accuracy of scientific study.
One of the things that happened in the 16th and 17th century is the emphasis on the experimental method. Greek science was observation of phenomena. They observed and they told, but they did not experiment.
Bacon's approach to studying nature is outlined in his book, The Great Restoration. He became known as the father of scientific method. These are his words.
There are a few people who do conduct experiments and invent things. But when they do, they don't follow a step-by-step procedure in their work, or a well-planned overall strategy. What I would like to do is to suggest a new method people can follow when they want to work on an important problem. This way, our knowledge of science will progress.
What Bacon was a visionary. Bacon actually believed that if you go out and examine nature, explore it, classify it, engage with it, document it, experience. I mean, Bacon talked about experience, not experiment, but experience. It would be possible to capture knowledge about nature and turn this knowledge to the benefit, Bacon says, of man's estate.
Bacon's ideas helped inspire many scientific societies, including England's Royal Society of London. These societies did much to promote research and growth in the sciences.
Not surprisingly, medicine was Bacon's, it was the thing he was most concerned about. He believed it was possible to actually get a handle on human health through the systematic study of the human body. So if there's a word for Bacon, it's visionary.
On our next stop on our historical timeline, we meet one of the geniuses of discovery, Galileo Galilei. Galileo did much of his research at the University of Padua. There he taught applications of mathematical principles, such as how to build bridges, fortify cities, and construct artillery. He did extensive research of motion and mechanics, and did experiments using balls and a slanted ramp that produced the law of uniform acceleration. In about 1609, he learned of a device made by a spectacle maker, a telescope made of a pipe fitted with lenses. Galileo improved on the design and constructed one of his own.
In short, he could get a magnification with it of about 14 times. This seems like nothing to us, but with it, he could see sections of the moon. He put this lens on the moon.
He discovered that the moon was not smooth as everyone had thought.
What he infers from seeing the moon through his telescope is that what he is seeing are the shadows left by real bodies. That the moon is not a crystalline sphere, that rather the moon is made of matter just as the earth is made of matter. Well, this is a dramatic shift.
I am filled with infinite astonishment and also infinite gratitude to God that it has pleased Him to make me alone the first observer of such wonderful things, which have been hidden in all past centuries.
In 1610, Galileo published his observations in a book he called The Messenger of the Stars. Galileo soon came under criticism from the Church. He was commanded to abandon his heretical opinions, and his book, The Messenger, was placed on the list of prohibited books. Galileo wrote these words to a friend.
I believe that there is no greater hatred in the whole world than that of ignorance for knowledge.
For 15 years, Galileo remained relatively silent. During this time, a new, more liberal pope was elected. In 1632, Galileo published Dialogue on the Two Chief Systems of the World. The authorities of the Church were outraged with his presentation favoring Copernicus. At the age of 70, Galileo was charged with heresy and sentenced to prison. Finally, Galileo issued his famous public apology.
I do not hold and have not held this opinion of Copernicus, since the command was intimated to me that I must abandon it.
According to legend, as the elderly Galileo walked away, he muttered under his breath,
Nevertheless, the earth does move.
He never actually went to prison. His books were banned, and he spent the rest of his life under house arrest in Florence. There he continued his scientific research. Shortly before his death, one of his greatest books, Discourses of Two New Sciences, was smuggled out of the country and published in Holland. The book presents a summary of the basic principles of dynamics and ballistics, and is considered by some to be his most important work. All of these great men made major contributions to our understanding and mastering of the world we live in. Their sacrifices in the search for truth and knowledge in a harsh, intolerant era can be an inspiration to us all.
That it hadn't all been said and done in the past, that there really were new frontiers. That's the exciting part, and I think out of that, a whole generation of new thinkers come.
Join us again as we continue our journey of discovery in part 2 of the Scientific Revolution.